Smoke choked him, not just in his lungs, but in his very soul. Jedediah, Jed. Stone stood on what used to be his porch, the smell of burnt cedar and singed earth a cruel mockery of home. His father's legacy, a lifetime of sweat and grit, was now nothing but twisted metal and ash. The fire hadn't been natural. A man just knew these things. This wasn't the wrath of nature, but the cold, calculated destruction of someone who wanted to erase every trace of the Stone name. Vengeance, a bitter taste, was already forming on his tongue, a promise to the ghosts of his past. The midday sun beat down, turning the charred remains of the Stone ranch into a shimmering, mournful mirage. Jed, a man whose skin was as weathered as old saddle leather, moved with a quiet purpose through the wreckage. His Stetson, usually a shield against the sun, was now a somber shadow, obscuring eyes that missed nothing. He crouched, sifting through the still warm ashes, his fingers, calloused from years of wrangling and mending, seeking any anomaly. A glint of something metallic caught his eye. Not the twisted remains of a horseshoe, nor a melted buckle, but a small, ornate silver spur, unlike anything he'd ever seen on his land. It was too fancy, too out of place. He reached out a trembling hand, taking it, turning it over. Fancy. Too fancy for this stretch of land. It started too fast, spread too quick, and now this. He gestured to the ruin with a sweep of his hand. The words hung in the air, a shadow over the scorched earth. He thought of his father, a man who'd clawed this ranch from the dust with his bare hands, a man who died believing in the sanctity of his land. Now that sanctity was gone, replaced by suspicion and a growing dread. He looked at the spur again, then at the desolate landscape. The choice was clear. He could pack up what little was left and ride away, or he could stand his ground and fight for what his father had built. The latter, he knew, was the only true path for a Stone. The question was, where to start? His usual calm was there, a steady anchor, but underneath it, a slow burn of anger was building. He watched Silas, noting the subtle tightening of the old man's jaw, the slight tremor in his hand as he held the spur. Silas knew something, unless someone's trying to make a statement, make money looking to buy up ranches, consolidate. Heard whispers about folks not wanting to sell. He paused, his eyes narrowing. You thinking what I'm thinking? He pocketed the spur, the chill of it a stark contrast to the heat of the smoldering ruins. His gaze drifted to the distant horizon, where the rolling hills met the endless sky. This was Silas, an old ranch hand who'd been with the Stones longer than Jed could remember. Silas was as gnarled and resilient as an ancient oak, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes keen despite their age. He'd seen a lot in his 70 years, and Jed trusted his quiet wisdom. The silence, usually a comfort on the prairie, was now an oppressive weight, broken only by the occasional creak of cooling timbers. He straightened up, his movements fluid despite the ache in his bones, and turned towards the makeshift camp he'd set up near the creek, a small fire flickering bravely against the vastness. Near the fire, a figure sat hunched, wielding a piece of wood with intense concentration. "Find anything?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble, without looking up from his whittling. He always knew. Jed pulled out the silver spur, letting it catch the light. It ain't ours." Silas finally looked up, his gaze fixing on the spur. Jed nodded slowly. "This wasn't no accident, Silas. Not a lick of it. That fire. Folks been talking about land out this way," Silas finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jed felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Land war. The morning after finding the spur, Jed and Silas rode into Harmony Gulch, a town barely clinging to existence on the dusty plains. It was a place where news traveled slow, but rumors festered like an infected wound. The air, usually thick with the smell of horse manure and stale beer, now carried a faint, unsettling scent of fear. The few townsfolk they passed offered averted gazes or mumbled greetings, their faces etched with a wary caution. Something was off. They tethered their horses outside the general store, its faded sign creaking in the dry breeze. Jed asked, his voice calm, but his eyes searching her face. Jed noticed a new, gleaming black buggy parked near the saloon, its polished brass fixtures glinting ostentatiously in the sun. Maud, the proprietor, a woman whose face was as crinkled as a dried apple, looked up, her usual warm smile absent. "Heard about your unfortunate setback. A true tragedy. But perhaps an opportunity?" Her eyes, usually twinkling with gossip, were shadowed with worry. Too new, too slick for Harmony Gulch. His eyes narrowed. "Some events ain't accidents, Mr. Thorne. My associates and I are interested in acquiring land in this region. We're offering fair prices for properties that might, shall we say, be difficult to maintain after the Silver Spur, the fire, Thorne's unsettling presence. It all clicked into place. This wasn't just about land. It was about power, about forcing people off their heritage. Jed looked at Silas, then back at the door where Thorne had disappeared. His hand instinctively went to the small, worn leather pouch where he kept his father's old pocket watch, a symbol of everything he was fighting to protect. But now, even that felt precarious. He had a choice: accept Thorne's offer, and walk away, or lose everything trying to fight a ghost he couldn't see. The taste of ash was back in his mouth, this time mixed with the bitter tang of defeat. Indeed, old man. The prairie can be a harsh mistress, and sometimes progress requires sacrifices. He turned back to Jed. "Think on it, Mr. Stone. A generous offer could ease your burdens considerably. We'll be in town a while." With a dismissive nod, he exited, the jingle of the bell a mocking echo. "Events such as yours." He gestured vaguely towards Jed, a mocking sympathy in his eyes. Her gaze flickered to Silas, then back to Jed, a silent plea in her eyes. Inside the store, the air was stuffy, smelling of dry beans and desperation. "Jedediah," she said, her voice hushed. "Heard about your place. Terribly sorry." "Thanks, Maud. Anything new been happening around here?" "Anyone new in town?" He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that held the cold, calculating glint of a predator. This was Elias Thorne, a name that had begun to circulate like a poison wind across the prairie. He surveyed the store with an air of ownership, his gaze lingering on Jed for a moment, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. Maud wrung her hands, glancing nervously towards the front door. Just a few new faces. Investors, they say. Looking to expand. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Seen him talking to folks who own land out near yours, offering good money. Too good, if you ask me." Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled, and a man stepped inside. "Mr. Stone," Thorne said, his voice smooth as silk, yet with an edge of steel. Jed felt a surge of cold fury, but his face remained impassive. "Opportunity for whom, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "For you, of course." Silas, who had remained silent until now, grunted. Thorne's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. Jed felt a cold dread settle in. Thorne wasn't just offering to buy land. He was making a veiled threat. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues that mimicked the recent inferno. Jed and Silas had ridden out of Harmony Gulch, leaving the unsettling presence of Elias Thorne behind, but his words lingered like a bad taste. "He wants to break us. Break everything my father built." They made camp near a small winding creek, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the crackling of their small fire. "See a chance to make a quick buck. Don't care who they step on." Jed stared into the flames, the silver spur cool and heavy in his hand. His father had taught him resilience, patience, and the unwavering belief in the land. But he hadn't taught him how to fight a shadow, a force that operated in the dark, burning homes and whispering threats. He would have, but your daddy also knew when to pick his battles. This ain't no common rustler, Jed. This is something bigger. Something with power and reach. He wants more than just land, Silas, Jed murmured, his voice a low growl. The thought of walking away, of letting Thorn win, was a poison. But what was the alternative? Fighting a wealthy, influential man with no proof, no allies, and only a burned-out ranch to his name? Silas, nursing a cup of black coffee, grunted. Always been men like that, Jed. Always will be. Sometimes, boy, the smart play ain't the fastest. Harmony Gulch was too small, too easily intimidated. He needed to find out more about Thorn, about his associates, about who else they were preying on. But his reason, tempered by his father's hard-earned wisdom, urged caution. He had to be smarter than Thorn, not just stronger. He had to gather information, find allies. The path ahead was unclear, shrouded in danger. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let his father's legacy turn to ash without a fight. He would follow his reason, but the burning embers of his heart would guide him. He needed to ride to Silver Creek, a larger town a few days' ride west, where the telegraph wires hummed and strangers weren't quite so easily silenced. Sometimes you gotta wait, watch, learn the beast's temper before you can tame it. Yet's mind drifted, the flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows that morphed into faces from his past. He wouldn't have let them take a single inch. He remembered his father, Thomas Stone, a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the land itself. A particularly brutal winter had just passed, and their cattle herd had been decimated. Jed remembered his father, his face grim but resolute, saying, "Son, sometimes the world tries to break you, but you gotta stand taller than the storm, always. This land, it's in our blood. It's what makes us stones." Thomas had a saying, "A man's worth ain't measured by the gold in his pocket, but by the dust on his boots and the truth in his word." Jed saw his father's calloused hands, teaching him to mend fences, to calm a skittish mar, to read the signs of the prairie. A sudden image flashed in Yet's mind. He was a boy, no older than 10, sitting on the porch swing with his father. Jed felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mix of sorrow and fierce pride. "My father would have fought," Jed said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. Silas nodded slowly. Jed looked at the spur again, then tossed it onto the dirt. It landed with a soft clink, gleaming malevolently. He remembered another lesson from his father, delivered after Jed had foolishly charged headfirst into a dangerous situation with a wild stallion. Jed ran a hand through his hair, the weariness settling deep in his bones. His heart told him to ride back to Harmony Gulch and confront Thorn, to show him the fight of a stone. The dust of the trail to Silver Creek felt heavier, each mile a test of Yet's resolve. Silver Creek was a bustling hub, a stark contrast to Harmony Gulch. The streets were crowded with wagons, horses, and men in suits, a cacophony of commerce and ambition. Jed felt like a ghost, a relic from a simpler time among the hurried modern world. He spent days in Silver Creek, piecing together fragments of information. Unlike some folks, he learned that Elias Thorn was merely the face of a shadowy corporation, the Western Land Syndicate, and that their ambition knew no bounds. Still digging in the dirt, Mr. Stone? Some men just don't know when to quit. Thorn's usual smirk was sharper, more predatory. He knew Jed was here, knew what he was doing. They were buying up ranches across the territory, often through intimidation, sometimes through outright violence. Silas. He hadn't told Thorn about Silas. That meant Thorn had eyes and ears everywhere, even in Harmony Gulch. This wasn't just about his land. It was about the people he cared about, people who had stood by his family for generations. Or what, Cowboy? You'll fight a force you can't even comprehend. You're alone, Mr. Stone. Everything seemed lost. Jed felt a crushing weight, the sheer enormity of Thorne's power, the hopelessness of his situation. He was just one man, against a syndicate with seemingly endless resources and no compunctions. Thorne had a point. He was alone. Your brand is the last one left on that prairie. Soon, it'll be erased, just like your home. The stories he heard of mysterious fires, of poisoned wells, of accidents, echoed his own tragedy. One afternoon, Jed was poring over old land deeds at the county office when a familiar, slick voice cut through the quiet. Careful, Cowboy. We're simply offering a solution. Sell your land. Walk away. Before more regrettable incidents occur. He paused, his gaze boring into Yet's. Stories about intimidation, about questionable land acquisitions, about suspicious fires. Perhaps you'd care to comment. Like that old fool Silas. Accidents happen to those who don't know when to mind their own business. His face, usually so smooth, contorted in a sneer. This is none of your business, woman. The tide hadn't turned, not yet, but a crack had appeared in Thorne's seemingly impenetrable facade. He wasn't alone, and for the first time since the fire, a flicker of hope ignited within him. This was Amelia Vance, a reporter he'd sought out, known for her fearless exposes of corporate corruption. She held a notepad and pencil, but her gaze was fixed on Thorne, unwavering. This isn't your prairie. And I have a feeling, Mr. Thorne, that a lot of people are going to be very interested in what I uncover. Yet's hand instinctively dropped to the worn grip of his own revolver, the leather smooth and familiar beneath his fingers. The air in the small office crackled with tension, every sound amplified. The scratch of a pen, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. This is progress. And progress, unlike a stubborn rancher, doesn't wait. Jed looked up to see Thorne, flanked by two burly, silent men. Just making sure the dirt's honest, Mr. Thorne, Jed replied, his voice calm, but a dangerous glint in his eyes. Thorne's eyes narrowed. Progress that burns homes? Jed shot back, the words cutting through the air. Progress that runs folks off their land? One of Thorne's men took a step forward, his hand twitching towards a concealed weapon. No need for theatrics, Mr. Stone, Thorne said, his voice dropping, a dangerous purr. Jed felt a cold wave of fear wash over him, quickly replaced by a white-hot rage. You leave Silas out of this, Jed snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Thorne chuckled, a chilling sound. A moment of silence hung heavy, stretched taut as a piano wire. Just as Thorne turned to leave, a voice cut through the stillness. He ain't alone, Thorne. Yet's head snapped up. Standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, was a tall, lean woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mr. Thorne, I've been hearing a lot of interesting stories about the Western Land Syndicate, Amelia said, her voice clear and resonant. Thorne's composure finally cracked. On the contrary, Amelia replied, stepping further into the office. It's very much my business. Jed looked from Thorne's furious face to Amelia's determined one. Amelia's unexpected appearance had sent Thorne retreating, but Jed knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The confrontation had left him raw, exposed. The subtle threat against Silas had struck a nerve, leaving him with a gnawing unease. Jed nursed a whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the turbulence within him. He was a cowboy, used to open spaces and honest challenges. This world of veiled threats and corporate maneuvering was a foreign, treacherous landscape. She had sources, other ranchers who'd been coerced, witnesses to suspicious activities. Her article could rally public opinion, potentially bringing in federal authorities. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. He thought of Silas, of his father's legacy, of the land that was now a battleground. He'd kept it, a small, tangible piece of what he'd lost. But it meant stepping out of the shadows, becoming a visible enemy. It meant risking everything, not just his life, but the lives of those around him. It was a decision that gnawed at him, a raw wound on his soul. His instinct screamed for a direct confrontation, a decisive act. His reason, however, warned of the consequences. Now, holding it, he realized its new meaning. It was a symbol of destruction, yes, but also of something that had endured the heat, even if scarred. It was a testament to resilience. He was tired, physically and emotionally drained. The solitary nature of his cowboy life, usually a comfort, now felt like a heavy burden. He was used to facing dangers alone, but this was a hydra-headed beast. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant murmur of the saloon. He had to choose: continue his lonely fight in the dark, or embrace the dangerous spotlight Amelia offered. He stood up, placing a few coins on the table. "Tell me when your article goes to print, Amelia, and tell me what you need." His voice was low, resolute, a cowboy's vow. He wasn't sure if it was courage or foolhardiness guiding him, but the path ahead, though fraught with danger, was now undeniably clear. He was riding into the fire, and this time, he wouldn't be alone. He felt a deep weariness, a profound sense of solitude, even with Amelia across from him. He knew she was an ally, but her fight was with words and ink, his with grit and lead. He was no longer just fighting for his land. He was fighting to protect the few people he had left. He and Amelia found a quiet saloon, away from Thorne's prying eyes. These syndicates operate like a spiderweb, drawing in information, squeezing out resistance. But they also hate exposure. That's our leverage. "He's more dangerous than I thought," Jed admitted, his voice hoarse. He knew about Silas. Amelia nodded, her expression grim. "He has eyes everywhere. It could make them back off, or at least force them to operate in the open. But it's risky. They won't take kindly to being exposed. You and I will be targets." She laid out her plan. She'd gathered enough evidence to write a scathing article, exposing Thorne and the Western Land Syndicate's ruthless tactics. "The article could turn things around, Jed," she said, her voice earnest. Jed looked into his whiskey, seeing not his reflection, but the flickering flames of his burned ranch. He remembered the old broken horseshoe he'd found in the ashes of his father's smithy, warped and blackened by the fire. Amelia's proposal offered a glimmer of hope, a desperate chance to fight back. He looked up at Amelia, her gaze steady, awaiting his answer. The days following Yet's decision were a blur of hushed conversations and tense anticipation. Amelia's article hit the newspapers with the force of a prairie thunderstorm, its headlines screaming about corporate greed and land grab schemes. He spoke of his father, of the land, of the simple justice he sought. His words, plain and unvarnished, resonated with people across the territory, igniting a quiet fury against the syndicate. The Western Land Syndicate was laid bare, its ruthless tactics exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Thorne, his face contorted in a mask of rage and desperation, stood alone, his usual henchmen having scattered at the sight of the united townsfolk. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Telegrams flew, reporters descended on Silver Creek, and suddenly Elias Thorne, once so untouchable, was under immense pressure. Jed, now a reluctant public figure, found himself giving interviews, his quiet cowboy demeanor a stark contrast to the sensational headlines. The fight had shifted, becoming something larger than two men. Yet's ranch remained a skeletal reminder of what was lost, but around it, new life was beginning to stir. Silas, now a permanent fixture at the rebuilt stone cabin, sat on the porch, whittling. Amelia, having secured a national reporting position, still visited, her articles continuing to advocate for justice and land rights. Other ranchers, emboldened by his stand, had refused to sell, choosing to rebuild and reclaim their heritage. The force of public opinion, the threat of legal action, and the unified defiance of the people Jed had inspired had done more damage than any bullet ever could. Thorn, exposed and defeated, was eventually driven out of the territory, his syndicate crumbling. The last brand on the prairie wasn't just his own. It was etched into the heart of every man and woman who had stood with him. And as the stars began to pepper the darkening sky, Jedediah Stone, the cowboy who fought for more than just land, knew that some things, like the spirit of the West, could never truly be burned away. He had lost his home, his tangible connection to his father's past. But he had gained something far more profound, the knowledge that the legacy his father built wasn't just in the fences and the cattle, but in the spirit of defiance and the unwavering belief in what was right. He had found his voice, not in anger, but in the quiet strength of his convictions. Then came the inevitable counterstrike. Thorn, desperate to salvage his crumbling empire, made a final, desperate move. He looked at it no longer a symbol of his enemies, but a reminder of the fire that had forged him anew. He turned it over in his hand, then, with a quiet sense of peace, he tossed it into the tall grass. It was a trinket from a battle won, but the true victory was in the unbroken spirit of the prairie. He sent his men to burn down the remaining structures in Harmony Gulch, a final, brutal message of intimidation. His heart hammered in his chest, a mix of dread and fierce determination. This was it, the final confrontation. But this time, the townsfolk were ready. Forewarned by Amelia's reporting and rallied by Yet's quiet courage, they met Thorn's thugs not with fear, but with defiance. Jed, riding back to Harmony Gulch with a posse of newly emboldened ranchers and townsfolk, saw the smoke rising in the distance. He met Thorn in the dusty main street of Harmony Gulch, the air thick with tension and the smell of burning wood. "You stubborn fool, Stone!" Thorn spat, his voice hoarse. "You ruined everything." Jed dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. "You were ruining everything, Thorn. You just needed someone to stand in your way." Their eyes met, a silent battle of wills. There was no gunfight, no dramatic showdown. The prairie was scarred, the wounds of the fires and the intimidation still raw. Nothing would ever truly be the same. Jed stood on the ridge overlooking his land, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Jed looked at the vast, open land, no longer solely his, but a symbol of a community's resilience. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver spur, the one he'd found in the ashes. He looked out at the fading light, the land stretching endlessly before him. "The prairie always finds a way to heal," he murmured, a quiet testament to the enduring spirit of the land and the men who loved it.